You ever notice how the loudest men in the room are usually the ones who've never heard a real combat radio go silent? The laughter came fast after that, sharp and careless beneath the warm glow of the Heritage Hall lights at Fort Ridgeline. Lieutenant Brandon Hayes leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been challenged by life outside a classroom or a command simulation. At 26 years old, freshly promoted and polished to perfection, he looked every inch the modern Army officer. Crisp dress uniform, silver bars catching the light. Jaw tight with authority, he wore a little too proudly. Around him, a cluster of young cadets and junior officers laughed along, eager to orbit the gravity of his confidence. Across the room, Ethan Cole sat alone near the old memorial display cases, his weathered hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The old man's faded field jacket hung loose across narrow shoulders bent slightly by age, but there was something strangely solid about him, something unmoving beneath the years. He looked out of place among the polished brass and bright ceremony banners. Like a forgotten photograph somebody forgot to take down. Hayes smirked and pointed loosely toward him with the neck of his water bottle. "Come on," he said, loud enough for half the hall to hear. "You're telling me your helicopter got shot down over Laos, your team vanished for 3 days, and somehow you still walked out carrying classified radio codes?" More laughter rolled through the room. Someone muttered, "Sounds like Netflix." Ethan didn't answer right away. The silence itself seemed to irritate Hayes even more. Outside the building, a dry Texas wind pushed dust across the base parking lot. Somewhere in the distance, rotor blades thumped slowly against the night sky from an incoming Black Hawk, making its final descent onto the airfield. The sound drifted faintly through the walls like an old memory clawing its way back to life. Ethan finally lifted his eyes. Pale blue. Calm. Exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. "Some missions weren't written down," he said quietly. Hayes laughed again, shaking his head as he looked toward the others. "That's convenient." The cadets chuckled harder this time. Phones quietly appeared. Someone started recording. Heritage Night had officially turned into entertainment. But near the back of the room, Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer stopped smiling. The old communications NCO had spent 22 years around signals intelligence before retirement dragged him unwillingly into civilian contracting. He recognized something in the old man's voice. Not fear, not exaggeration, restraint. The kind carried by people who learned long ago that the truth sounded unbelievable to anyone who hadn't lived it. Mercer slowly lowered the styrofoam cup in his hand. Hayes stood and walked closer now, feeding off the attention. "So what unit was this miracle mission with?" he asked. "CIA ghosts. Secret commandos. Space Marines." The room erupted again. Ethan stared down at the coffee in his hands. The overhead lights reflected faintly against a small metal object clipped near the inside pocket of his jacket. Old brass, worn smooth by time. Hayes noticed it immediately. "What's that?" he asked. Ethan said nothing. Hayes stepped closer anyway. "Some kind of souvenir?" Still no answer. The laughter around them began to thin, replaced by something less certain. The old man's silence no longer felt weak. It felt heavy, like storm clouds gathering somewhere just beyond the horizon. And for the first time that night, Brandon Hayes realized the veteran wasn't embarrassed. He was remembering something. The room never fully recovered after that silence. The laughter faded unevenly, like men suddenly realizing they had walked farther onto thin ice than they intended. Lieutenant Brandon Hayes forced a grin anyway, though it no longer came as naturally as before. He crossed his arms and leaned casually against one of the display tables filled with faded reconnaissance photos and rusted field radios from wars most of the cadets only knew through documentaries. "Right," he said with a short laugh. "Because secret missions are always the ones nobody can prove." A few nervous chuckles answered him, weaker this time. Ethan Cole remained seated near the memorial wall, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing. The old veteran looked smaller now beneath the bright overhead lights, almost fragile at first glance, but the stillness around him carried an unusual weight. It reminded Master Sergeant Mercer of something he had felt years ago inside underground command bunkers overseas, when experienced operators stopped talking because they sensed trouble before anyone else did. Ethan lifted the paper cup slightly, staring into the black coffee as though the surface carried ghosts only he could see. Most men who came back never talked about Laos, he said quietly. The smart ones anyway. Hayes smirked again, but there was uncertainty beneath it now. You expect anybody here to believe that? Ethan shrugged faintly. Does not matter much now. Outside the hall, the sound of rotor blades faded into the distance. Through the tall glass windows near the entrance, sodium floodlights painted the base streets in pale amber. Young soldiers moved between buildings carrying duffel bags and coffee cups, living ordinary lives beneath a peaceful American sky, completely unaware of the strange tension tightening inside Heritage Hall. One of the cadets stepped closer to Ethan's table, phone still raised halfway for video. So what happened then? He asked. You just walked out of the jungle alone? Ethan looked up slowly. His pale eyes settled on the young man for a moment before drifting toward the old military photographs hanging along the wall. Black and white faces stared back from another century. No one walks out alone, he murmured. The answer landed strangely hard in the room. Hayes quickly jumped back in before the mood slipped away from him entirely. Come on, Sergeant Major Storytime, he said. If you were really out there running Black Ops in Laos, then you had a call sign, right? That pulled a few grins back onto the cadets' faces. Familiar ground again. Military culture reduced everything eventually to patches, ranks, and call signs. Hayes pointed lightly toward Ethan with the confidence of a man certain he was cornering a harmless fraud. What was it? He asked. Snake? Ghost? Reaper? Ethan said. Nothing. The old veteran simply stared toward the far end of the hall where a faded green reconnaissance flag hung behind glass. Dust floated lazily through the warm light above him. Somewhere deeper inside the building, an air conditioning vent rattled softly like distant radio static. Hayes stepped closer. What was your call sign? He repeated louder this time. The room waited. Even the cadets recording on their phones had stopped smiling now. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the old brass lighter clipped near his jacket pocket. His thumb brushed across the worn engraving with the familiarity of a man touching a gravestone. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper. Nomad 6. The effect was immediate. Near the back of the hall, Master Sergeant Mercer froze so suddenly his coffee slipped from his hand and splashed across the polished floor. Several heads turned sharply toward him, but Mercer barely noticed. The color had drained from his face. Because 30 years earlier, buried inside an encrypted Cold War communications archive at Fort Meade, he had seen those exact words stamped across a classified recovery transcript that officially did not exist. The silence after those two words felt unnatural, as if the entire room had inhaled at once and forgotten how to breathe again. Coffee spread slowly across the polished floor near Master Sergeant Mercer's boots, dripping from the crushed styrofoam cup still hanging loosely in his trembling hand. Lieutenant Hayes frowned immediately, irritation flashing across his face. Seriously? He said with a laugh that sounded thinner now. That is what rattled you. Mercer did not answer. His eyes remained locked on Ethan Cole. The old veteran sat exactly as before, shoulders relaxed, weathered fingers resting against the brass lighter near his jacket pocket. Calm, unmoved. But Mercer's pulse hammered hard against his ribs. Because he remembered the archive room at Fort Meade. Windowless walls. Fluorescent lights humming overhead at 2 in the morning. Rows of classified signal recovery files from operations officially erased before most of the officers in this room had even been born. And among those records, one call sign had appeared over and over like a ghost buried beneath layers of black ink and redacted pages. Nomad 6. Hayes took another step forward, feeding off the confused looks around him. What? Is this some famous Vietnam thing now? He asked. Should we all salute? A few cadets chuckled uncertainly, but nobody sounded comfortable anymore. The atmosphere inside Heritage Hall had shifted too far. Even the younger soldiers could feel it now. The warm air suddenly seemed tighter, heavier. Mercer finally moved. He set the crushed cup onto a nearby table without taking his eyes off Ethan. Lieutenant, he said carefully, maybe let it go. Hayes blinked in surprise. Excuse me. Mercer's jaw tightened. I said let it go. That only made the younger officer more defensive. His posture straightened immediately, authority snapping back into place like a reflex. With respect, Master Sergeant, this is a public event. The man told a story. I asked a question. Ethan remained silent while the tension thickened around him like gathering storm clouds. Beyond the windows, headlights from a passing Humvee swept briefly across the hall before disappearing into the dark bay streets outside. Somewhere overhead, the old ventilation system rattled softly. Hayes folded his arms. What exactly is everybody acting so weird about? Mercer looked toward him slowly. For a second, he seemed about to say something. Then he stopped himself. The old communications NCO had spent decades learning when not to speak. Instead, he turned toward Ethan again. Sir, he asked quietly, where did you hear that call sign? Several heads turned sharply back toward the old veteran. Ethan's pale eyes lifted from the coffee cup in his hands. I did not hear it, he said. It was mine. The room went dead still. No laughter this time. No whispers. Just the faint electrical buzz from the ceiling lights and the distant hum of generators somewhere across the base. Hayes forced out another scoff, but now it sounded almost desperate. Okay, enough, he said. You expect anyone here to believe you were some legendary Black Ops phantom? Ethan studied him for a long moment. Not angry, not offended, only tired. No, he said softly. I expect most people not to. That answer unsettled Hayes more than any argument could have. Because the old man was not trying to convince anyone. He did not need approval. He did not even seem interested in defending himself. He simply carried the weight of something the others could not see. Mercer suddenly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Hayes noticed immediately. What are you doing? Mercer ignored him. His fingers moved quickly across the screen while he stepped toward the corner of the hall near the old memorial flags. The signal bars flickered weakly beneath the thick concrete walls of the building. Ethan watched him go without expression. Hayes laughed nervously. You cannot seriously be buying this. Mercer finally looked back over his shoulder. The color still had not returned to his face. Lieutenant, he said quietly, if that man really is who I think he is, then everybody in this room needs to stop talking right now. Then he pressed the phone to his ear and spoke 4 words that instantly changed the direction of the night. I need secure operations. The reaction on the other end of the secure line came faster than Master Sergeant Mercer expected. He stood near the darkened corner of Heritage Hall with one hand pressed tightly against his other ear, trying to block out the low hum of confused voices behind him. Repeat that call sign, the voice demanded immediately. Mercer swallowed once. Nomad 6, he said quietly. Silence answered him for nearly 3 full seconds. Then papers shifted sharply through the speaker. A chair scraped backward somewhere far away. Who gave you that identification? The voice asked. Mercer looked across the room toward Ethan Cole. The old veteran still sat alone beside the memorial display, calm beneath the warm ceiling lights, while Lieutenant Hayes paced nearby with growing irritation. An elderly civilian guest, Mercer replied carefully. Male. Approximately mid-80s. White male. Identified himself as Ethan Cole. Another silence followed. This one heavier, colder. Mercer heard muted voices in the background now, rapid and tense. Then the speaker returned lower than before. Do not let him leave. Mercer frowned. Sir, do not let him leave the building. The line clicked dead. Across the hall, Hayes was still trying to reclaim control of the room. This is insane, he said loudly. One spooky nickname, and suddenly everybody acts like we summoned a ghost. A few cadets laughed weakly, but nobody committed fully anymore. Their uncertainty had started feeding on itself. Even the younger soldiers filming earlier had lowered their phones. Ethan remained seated near the old reconnaissance exhibit, his weathered face unreadable beneath the soft yellow lights overhead. He looked less like a man trying to impress people and more like someone quietly enduring a storm he had seen many times before. Hayes pointed toward Mercer. Seriously, what did they tell you? Mercer ignored the question and walked slowly back toward Ethan instead. The old wooden floor creaked faintly beneath his boots. Around them, framed combat photographs lined the walls of Heritage Hall like frozen windows into forgotten decades. Helicopters lifting through jungle haze. Young men standing shoulder to shoulder beside radio towers and dirt runways that no longer existed. Mercer stopped a few feet from Ethan. Sir, he said quietly, when was the last time someone called you that? Ethan stared at the coffee cup in his hands for a long moment before answering. 1972. The words landed softly, but something about them chilled the room again. Outside, a cold gust of wind rattled the flagpole cables beyond the parking lot. Hayes folded his arms harder across his chest now. Defensive, cornered without understanding why. You people are unbelievable, he muttered. What was he? Some Cold War superhero? Ethan finally looked up at him. There was no anger in his face. Only age. Endless age. No, he said softly. Just the one who came back. Nobody spoke after that. The sentence hung in the air like distant thunder. Mercer felt the hairs rise slightly along his arms. Because buried deep inside those old intelligence archives was one classified notation he had never forgotten. Recon Team Nomad. 6 operators inserted. Across the Laos border during a denied operation in 1972. Official extraction status. Lost during mission failure. Presumed deceased. Mercer remembered staring at that file for nearly an hour all those years ago because one detail made no sense. 5 names had death confirmations attached to them. One did not. No body recovered. No final report. Only a blacked-out section followed by 3 stamped words. Record sealed permanently. A sudden vibration buzzed hard against Mercer's phone. Incoming secure callback. His chest tightened immediately when he saw the number. Pentagon routing code. Hayes noticed the expression on his face. What now? Mercer answered the call carefully. The voice that greeted him this time was colder. Higher authority. Master Sergeant Mercer. The man said, you are to remain where you are. Transportation is already en route. Mercer blinked. Transportation? Yes. A pause followed. And for everyone's sake, Lieutenant Hayes needs to stop talking to that man immediately. The atmosphere inside Heritage Hall changed completely after that phone call. The casual warmth of the event was gone now, replaced by something colder and impossible to define. Conversations had collapsed into whispers. Cadets who had arrived expecting stories and photographs now stood quietly near the walls, watching Ethan Cole the way people watch distant lightning rolling across an open field. Lieutenant Hayes tried to maintain control of himself, but the strain had started showing around his eyes. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. Absolutely ridiculous. No one answered him. Master Sergeant Mercer lowered his phone slowly, his face tight with tension. The secure voice on the other end had not sounded confused or skeptical. It had sounded alarmed. That bothered him more than anything else. Ethan remained seated near the memorial display, hands folded loosely around the old brass lighter resting against his knee. The overhead lights reflected softly across its worn metal surface. For a moment, Mercer found himself staring at the object instead of the man. 40 years of use had polished the edges smooth. Tiny scratches crossed the brass like faded scars. On one side, barely visible beneath the light, were engraved coordinates almost rubbed away by time. Hayes noticed Mercer looking at it. What is so special about that thing? He asked. Ethan glanced down at the lighter in his hand. His thumb brushed slowly across the engraving. The movement was small, almost absent-minded, but the second his skin touched the metal, something inside his expression shifted. The room around him seemed to fall away. The warm lights of Heritage Hall dissolved into darkness and rain. Thick jungle humidity pressed against young skin slick with sweat and mud. Rotor blades thundered overhead somewhere beyond the trees, chopping through low clouds illuminated by pale green instrument lights. Radio static hissed endlessly through a headset pressed tight against Ethan's ears while exhausted voices cracked across the transmission channel. Nomad 6, report position. He remembered the smell first. Wet earth. Aviation fuel. Smoke drifting through heavy jungle air after a storm. The sound of boots splashing through shallow water. The metallic clatter of equipment bouncing against soaked fatigues during movement through terrain that never truly slept. Young Ethan crouched beneath massive trees with 6 other men barely visible through sheets of rain. Faces streaked with camouflage paint. Eyes hollow from exhaustion. Nobody speaking unless necessary. The mission had already gone wrong days earlier. Maps no longer matched reality. Extraction windows kept collapsing. Radio contact faded in and out beneath the mountains. One young operator beside him shivered uncontrollably despite the heat, clutching a damaged field radio wrapped tightly against his chest. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the same brass lighter. Fresh then, untarnished. A gift from a helicopter pilot who had laughed while handing it over weeks earlier at a remote airstrip in Thailand. For luck, the pilot had said. Ethan remembered flicking the lighter open beneath the jungle canopy while rain hammered the leaves overhead. The small flame glowed weakly against the darkness as he studied smeared coordinates scratched into the brass casing by hand. Their last possible extraction point. Their last route home. Nomad 6. A strained voice crackled through the headset again. "You still with us?" Young Ethan pressed the transmit button slowly. "Still here." The memory vanished instantly. Heritage Hall rushed back into focus around him. Warm air. Quiet whispers. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Ethan blinked once, his weathered face tightening almost imperceptibly before settling again into calm silence. Across from him, Lieutenant Hayes frowned uneasily. "You okay?" he asked, though his voice carried far less arrogance now. Ethan looked toward him for a moment. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you survive something your mind never really leaves." The answer settled heavily across the room. Mercer swallowed hard. He had spent most of his life around soldiers, but there was something different about Ethan Cole. The old man did not speak like someone telling war stories. He spoke like someone still carrying the weather of another world inside him. Before anyone could answer, headlights suddenly swept across the tall windows at the front of the hall. Multiple vehicles, black SUVs moving fast through the parking lot outside. Every conversation inside the room stopped instantly. Mercer turned toward the entrance. His pulse dropped cold into his stomach. Because military police were already stepping out before the engines had even finished shutting down. The black SUVs rolled into the parking lot with the smooth precision of vehicles that did not waste time explaining themselves. Their headlights cut across the dark windows of Heritage Hall in sharp white bands before the engines shut down almost simultaneously. The room had gone completely silent now. Even Lieutenant Hayes stopped talking. Outside, military police officers stepped out first, their movements quick and controlled beneath the cold floodlights lining the base roads. Then another figure emerged from the second vehicle. Gray-haired, tall, civilian coat over a dark uniform beneath. The moment Master Sergeant Mercer saw the silver star pinned near the man's collar, his stomach tightened hard. Senior Command. Ethan Cole did not even turn toward the windows. He remained seated near the memorial display with the old brass lighter resting loosely in his weathered hand. Calm, patient, like a man who had already seen the ending before everyone else realized they were inside the story. Hayes looked around uneasily at the growing tension in the room. "This is completely insane," he muttered. "All this over some old call sign." Nobody answered him. Because deep down, every soldier in that hall understood something instinctively now. The military only moved this fast when the situation touched something buried very high above ordinary clearance levels. The entrance doors opened sharply. Cold night air swept inside, carrying the distant scent of jet fuel and rain-soaked asphalt. The military police entered first, scanning the room automatically before stepping aside for the older officer behind them. Conversations vanished completely. The man moved with the quiet authority of someone long accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered. His eyes swept across Heritage Hall once before locking directly onto Ethan Cole. He stopped walking immediately. For a second, nobody moved at all. The older officer looked suddenly older than when he had entered, as though 40 years had landed on his shoulders in a single breath. "My God," he whispered. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward him. Recognition flickered there, faint and distant. "You got old too, Robert." Several cadets exchanged confused looks immediately. Lieutenant Hayes frowned harder. The officer standing before them was Lieutenant General Robert Whitaker, Deputy Commander of Joint Operations Command. One of the most respected names on the entire base. And right now the three-star general looked shaken. Truly shaken. Whitaker took another slow step forward, his eyes fixed on Ethan as if afraid the old man might disappear if he blinked. "We buried an empty casket for you in 1973, he said quietly. The words crashed through the room harder than shouting ever could. Hayes felt his throat tighten immediately. Ethan looked down briefly at the brass lighter in his hand. "I know," he answered softly. No one in Heritage Hall seemed capable of breathing normally anymore. The younger cadets stared openly now, phones forgotten at their sides. Mercer stood frozen near the memorial wall, unable to stop replaying those sealed archive records in his mind. Lost during mission failure. Presumed deceased. Record sealed permanently. Lieutenant Hayes tried to force a laugh, but it died halfway out of his mouth. "Wait," he said carefully. You were saying this guy was officially dead? General Whitaker turned slowly toward him. The expression in the general's eyes stopped Hayes cold before another word could leave his mouth. Lieutenant, Whitaker said quietly. Do you have any idea who you have been speaking to tonight? Hayes opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since the evening began, he genuinely looked young. Whitaker turned back toward Ethan. His voice lowered. We searched for months after Laos, he said. No signal. No survivors. Nothing. Ethan's tired gaze drifted toward the dark windows where rain had started falling lightly across the parking lot outside. Some of us made it farther than expected, he murmured. The general swallowed hard. His eyes moved briefly toward the old brass lighter, then toward the faded reconnaissance flag hanging behind glass nearby. Nomad team, he said quietly. 6 men inserted across the border. Ethan nodded once. 5 came home. The silence that followed felt enormous, because everyone in that room understood exactly what he meant. One of them had not. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of Heritage Hall, while nobody inside seemed willing to move. The entire room remained locked around Ethan Cole as though the old veteran had somehow shifted the gravity of the building itself. Lieutenant General Whitaker stood only a few feet away now, his expression carrying something rare in senior officers. Not authority. Reverence. Lieutenant Hayes noticed it immediately, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else had tonight. Because men like Whitaker did not look at ordinary soldiers that way. Hayes glanced around the hall. Cadets stood silent near the walls. Junior officers avoided speaking altogether. Even the military police, near the entrance, had relaxed their posture slightly, no longer treating the situation like a security concern. It felt more like they were guarding something sacred. Ethan slowly slipped the brass lighter back into his jacket pocket. The movement seemed to pull Whitaker out of whatever memory had caught him. The general exhaled quietly before speaking again. You disappeared after the extraction signal failed, he said. Nobody knew how you got out. Ethan looked toward the rain outside. Some roads home are longer than others. Hayes frowned. The answer irritated him because it still sounded impossible. With respect, sir, he said carefully toward Whitaker. Are we seriously talking about some classified jungle mission from 50 years ago like it changes anything? The second the words left his mouth, Mercer shut his eyes briefly. Too late. Whitaker turned slowly toward the young lieutenant. Changes anything? The general's voice remained calm, but the air in the room tightened immediately. Hayes shifted uneasily beneath the weight of it. Whitaker stepped closer. Lieutenant, there are operations in this country's history that shaped entire decades without ever appearing in public records. Men vanished carrying burdens nobody was allowed to acknowledge. Some came home and stayed silent because silence was part of the job. He looked back toward Ethan. And some men carried that silence longer than anyone should have. The hall remained motionless around them. Ethan himself showed no reaction at all. No pride. No bitterness. Just exhaustion worn smooth by time. One of the younger cadets near the back finally spoke in a hushed voice. Sir, who exactly was he? Whitaker studied Ethan for several seconds before answering. Recon Team Nomad operated in places this government denied existed. Deep reconnaissance. Signal recovery. Personnel extraction. Missions where survival depended entirely on the judgment of 6 men alone in terrain most people here cannot imagine. Hayes swallowed quietly now. The confidence he had worn all evening was draining fast. Whitaker continued. In 1972, Nomad Team vanished during an operation near the Laos border. After severe weather collapsed extraction windows for nearly 72 hours. Multiple recovery attempts failed. The rain outside intensified slightly, streaking across the dark glass in silver lines beneath the floodlights. Ethan's eyes drifted downward as though he could still hear rotor blades somewhere far away beyond the storm. We lost contact on the 3rd night, Whitaker said quietly. Then one transmission finally came through. Mercer stared at him carefully. What did it say, sir? Whitaker's jaw tightened faintly. 3 words. His eyes shifted toward Ethan. Nomad Six standing. The room fell silent again. The phrase settled into the hall like an echo from another lifetime. Hayes felt cold move slowly through his chest. Because for the first time tonight, the old veteran no longer seemed like a confused, elderly man telling impossible stories. He felt real. Terribly real. Whitaker took one slow breath before continuing. By the time recovery teams reached the extraction point, 5 operators were alive because one man kept moving them through jungle terrain during 3 days of storms and failed radio contact. Ethan lowered his eyes slightly. They were young, he murmured. Could not leave them there. Nobody knew what to say after that. The simplicity of the sentence somehow carried more weight than any metal citation ever could. Then Whitaker did something that shocked everyone in the room. The 3-star general straightened fully, brought his hand sharply upward, and rendered a formal salute directly to Ethan Cole. The sound of his glove brushing against the brim of his cap cut through the hall like a rifle crack. And one by one, every military member in the room instinctively stood at attention. The salute spread through Heritage Hall like a silent wave. One by one, every uniformed service member in the room rose instinctively to attention. Boots shifted sharply against the polished floor. Hands moved upward in near-perfect synchronization. Cadets, sergeants, captains, even the military police near the entrance straightened immediately beneath the cold white lights. The only person left standing uncertainly in the middle of the room was Lieutenant Brandon Hayes. His face had gone pale. He looked around slowly as though trying to understand how the entire night had slipped beyond his control. Just 1 hour earlier, Ethan Cole had seemed like nothing more than an aging veteran telling impossible stories to pass time at a base event. Now a 3-star general stood before him in complete silence with his salute unwavering. Ethan looked visibly uncomfortable beneath the attention. His tired eyes drifted across the room, stopping briefly on the younger soldiers now frozen respectfully around him. "General," he said quietly, "that is not necessary." Whitaker lowered his hand slowly, but his expression never changed. "It is overdue." The words settled heavily into the hall. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows, while distant thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the airfield. Ethan exhaled quietly and looked toward the old reconnaissance photographs hanging along the walls. Young faces stared back from another century. Most of them were smiling. Hayes finally found his voice again. "Sir," he said carefully toward Whitaker, "why was everything buried?" Nobody answered immediately. Whitaker glanced toward the military police near the door before looking back at Ethan. For a second, it almost seemed like he was asking permission. Ethan gave the smallest nod. The general folded his hands behind his back. "Because some operations during that period officially never happened," he said quietly. "No government acknowledgement. No public records. No recognition ceremonies." His eyes moved toward Ethan again. Men like him disappeared into classified history, whether they survived or not. Mercer watched Ethan carefully. The old veteran never reacted to the words. No bitterness. No pride. Only the distant expression of someone who stopped expecting recognition decades ago. One nervous cadet near the back finally spoke. "Then how did he come home?" The room turned toward Ethan again. For several long seconds, the old veteran said nothing at all. Then his weathered hand slipped once more toward the brass lighter in his pocket. Slowly, he answered. The simplicity of the reply somehow made it even heavier. Hayes swallowed hard. "You never told anyone?" Ethan looked toward him calmly. "Could not." Whitaker nodded quietly. The surviving members were sealed under national security restrictions for years. By the time portions of the records were finally reviewed again, most of the men connected to the operation were already gone. He paused briefly, and Ethan refused every interview request ever sent to him. Hayes stared at the old veteran in disbelief. "Why?" Ethan's pale eyes drifted toward the rain outside. "Because the men who did not come home deserved more attention than the one who did." The answer hit the room harder than any speech could have. Mercer looked down briefly, jaw tightening. Around the hall, several younger soldiers lowered their eyes in silence. They had spent years surrounded by social media, publicity campaigns, and carefully polished military image culture. Yet the quiet old man standing before them carried something older, a kind of dignity that asked for nothing at all. Whitaker stepped slowly toward the memorial display near Ethan's chair. Behind the glass rested dozens of old unit patches and reconnaissance artifacts collected over decades. The general reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed a weathered photograph folded at the edges from years of handling. He placed it gently onto the display table beneath the lights. "We found this in the archives last year," he said quietly. Ethan looked down at the photograph. The room slowly gathered closer behind him. It showed 6 young men standing beside a helicopter deep beneath jungle clouds, their uniforms soaked from rain, faces exhausted but alive. Time had faded the image almost beyond recognition. But one thing remained perfectly clear. Painted beneath the helicopter door in white block letters were the words Nomad Team 6. And standing in the center of the photograph, barely 20 years old, was Ethan Cole. For a long moment, nobody in Heritage Hall moved at all. The old photograph rested beneath the display lights while rain whispered softly against the windows behind them. 6 young men frozen forever in faded jungle haze. 6 faces carrying the hard confidence of people who had already accepted there was no guarantee of tomorrow. Lieutenant Brandon Hayes stared at the photograph in complete silence. He looked from the young soldier standing at the center of the image back to the elderly veteran beside him, struggling to connect the 2 men as the same person. The realization settled slowly across his face. Shame arrived right behind it. Ethan Cole studied the photograph quietly. His thumb brushed faintly against the folded corner where time had nearly worn the image apart. Tommy hated having his picture taken, he murmured softly. Whitaker gave a faint smile. Still looks angry in every photo. A few quiet laughs moved carefully through the room, fragile and respectful. Ethan's eyes drifted across the other faces in the picture one by one. Men who had once laughed beside helicopter engines beneath monsoon skies. Men who had grown younger every year while he grew old. The room waited for him to say more, but he did not. He simply folded the photograph carefully and handed it back to Whitaker. Keep it in the archive, he said. It belongs with them. Whitaker nodded slowly, though emotion tightened visibly in his expression now. We spent decades trying to find answers about what happened out there, he said quietly. Ethan looked toward the rain beyond the windows. Sometimes surviving is the answer. Nobody spoke after that. The younger soldiers standing around the hall no longer looked at Ethan with curiosity. They looked at him with the kind of respect that cannot be ordered by rank or ceremony. It had been earned somewhere far away in another century beneath conditions most of them would never fully understand. Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward slowly at last. The confidence that once carried him through the evening was gone completely. He stopped a few feet from Ethan, shoulders stiff beneath his dress uniform. Sir, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Ethan looked at him calmly. Hayes lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. I thought you were exaggerating. I thought. He stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence. Ethan saved him from it. You thought I was old, he said gently. Hayes gave a weak nod. Ethan's expression softened slightly for the first time all night. That part is true. A few smiles appeared around the hall again, small and genuine this time. Hayes swallowed hard. I should not have laughed. Ethan studied the young lieutenant for several seconds before answering. Every generation thinks the last one was simpler than it really was, he said quietly. That is how time works. Hayes nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Outside, the rain had begun easing into a fine mist beneath the floodlights. The black government vehicles remained waiting near the curb, engines idling softly in the dark. Whitaker glanced toward them before looking back at Ethan. Transportation is ready whenever you are, he said. Ethan stood carefully from his chair. Age showed itself briefly, then in the slow movement of his knees and shoulders. But something about him still carried the same quiet steadiness visible in the photograph from 50 years earlier. The military police near the entrance straightened automatically as he approached. One young specialist opened the hall doors without being asked. Cool night air drifted inside, carrying the scent of rain and jet fuel across the room. Ethan paused once near the doorway and looked back toward the memorial hall one final time. Young soldiers, old photographs, flags hanging motionless beneath soft lights. An entire generation staring silently at a man history had almost erased. Then Ethan gave the smallest nod and stepped out into the night. Nobody spoke as the doors slowly closed behind him. Inside Heritage Hall, Lieutenant Hayes remained standing beside the old reconnaissance display long after the vehicles disappeared into the darkness beyond the base gates. And for the first time in his military career, he finally understood something no classroom had ever taught him. Some men never asked to be remembered, but the world changes the moment you realize who they were.